If you would, let me invite you to take a copy of God's Word and meet me in the book of Acts, the 12th chapter. Acts chapter 12 is where we will be focused in the next several moments. Now, it's taken us almost a year, May 2025. That's when we began this particular series of sermons through the opening 12 chapters of the book of Acts. We've had some interruptions along the way, different little standalone sermons, of course. But it's been almost a year, and we have come to the final sermon in this particular series through these chapters. You heard me correctly. We are going to get through an entire chapter today, which I know is a rare feat for us here, but Easter is approaching. Now, after the holiday, my hope is to begin a new series, and I'll tell you more about that in the future. But then we want to, Lord willing, circle back to Acts 13 and begin to trace the rest of the story, which is when these missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul really begin to unfold. And so our attention really shifts to this larger global mission of the church. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Before we get to that, Luke pulls back the curtain one more time to show us how God is still at work on behalf of the church in Jerusalem. So the narrative is about to shift very strongly from Jerusalem, away from Jerusalem in many respects, but Luke doesn't want us as readers to wrongly infer from this that God has less care for the church of Jerusalem, or that his care for the church of Jerusalem had waned. It had not. And I think these stories are designed to reflect that, to reinforce those truths. He doesn't want us to think that now that the Gentiles are being reached, that the Jews don't matter. That's not what he's saying. We're all part of this one people, this one church. Now, before we look at that, though, I often like to read the entirety of the text on the front end, but sometimes when we're in narrative, I like to take it piece by piece to preserve some of the suspense somewhat as we work our way through it. And I want to adopt that approach today so that we can see how this unfolds. It's a very funny story in some respects and a very tragic tale in others. But the first idea that I want us to explore in the text relates to this conflict between these two kingdoms. This is common language. We think of Augustine, right? The two-kingdom language. And we see that very much at work in this text. The narrative begins with this sharp shift from the burgeoning mission in Antioch back to the theater in Jerusalem. But look with me at how chapter 12 begins, the opening verse. Luke says, "About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church." So he's thinking particularly of the church there in Jerusalem. Now, the antagonist here is a guy named Herod. This is Herod Agrippa the First. Okay, Herod Agrippa the First. He is the architect of the crisis that we're about to read about. But before we get to his machinations against the church in Jerusalem, I think it'd be worthwhile to just think a little bit about his background and how Herod came into power and so on in this larger Herodian dynasty. Because as you read the New Testament, you see there's several figures actually that are mentioned by the name of Herod and this family, and it can be a little confusing. I might make it more confusing, but I'm going to try to help you connect some of these dots. So this dynasty, this Herodian dynasty, has a family legacy of consistently opposing the purposes of God, beginning with another Herod. This is Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the grandfather of Herod Agrippa I, the Herod who we're reading about here in Acts 12. And Herod the Great was the ruler who ordered the slaughter of all those male children 2 years and younger in and around the city of Bethlehem following the birth of Jesus, which we read about in Matthew chapter 2. So he was not a nice guy. Okay, not a nice guy. And indeed, he is largely remembered for his tyrannical rule and his extreme paranoia, which eventually leads him to execute his own son, Aristobulus, who happens to be the father of Herod Agrippa, the Herod in our text today. So after his father was killed by his grandfather, imagine that, Herod Agrippa ends up going to Rome. He's sent to Rome, I think he's 4 at the time, in order for safety and to gain some education as he matures. And when Herod the Great dies, his kingdom ends up being divided among these various sons. He had 3 sons in particular that take most of the power, and these would have been our Herod's uncles. From the perspective of the New Testament Gospels, the most prominent of these sons was another Herod by the name of Herod Antipas, who was the one with the dubious distinction of being the man to behead John the Baptist and the one to preside over the trials of Jesus. Now, eventually, Herod Agrippa I, again, I'm going to call him our Herod to make it a little bit more simple since he's in Acts 12, he ends up fleeing from Rome in AD 23 because while he was in Rome, he becomes something of a playboy, and he needs to escape because he owes a lot of money to these creditors, and so he runs away, and he goes to live in much more poverty and obscurity in Palestine under the rule of Herod Antipas. When he decides to return eventually back to Rome, he ends up being imprisoned by the Emperor Tiberius because he couldn't help but run his mouth against the emperor. And it wasn't until the Emperor Tiberius dies that Herod's fortunes begin to change. With Tiberius no more, Caligula comes to power, and Caligula happens to be a childhood friend of our Herod. Caligula releases him from prison, exchanges his iron chains for gold chains that were just as weighty, according to some historical accounts, and he eventually makes him the ruler of certain Palestinian provinces. When Caligula dies, another guy named Claudius, who happens to be another childhood friend of theirs, comes to power, and he made our Herod Agrippa I, the ruler of Judea and Samaria under Roman delegation. And thus, our text this morning simply refers to him as Herod the King in verse 1. And in this position, he becomes something of a political chameleon. He acts one way among the Romans in order to curry their favor, and another way among the Jews in order to curry theirs. And it worked. In time, he successfully navigates the Roman imperial circles and the Jewish sensitivities to consolidate a kingdom nearly as large as his grandfather's. In fact, he very much acts like a Jew. He participates in some of the offerings and he observes some of the festivals and things like this. So he is very much playing the political game of these various constituents, and he's very good at it. Now, this brief historical overview, while it's certainly incomplete, it should suffice to convince us, especially after we finish reading Acts 12, that Herod Agrippa, our Herod, shared the characteristics of his evil family. Nothing that we read in Acts chapter 12 should surprise us. The apple did not fall far from the tree. Herod Agrippa, like most of the Herodians before him, was a people pleaser. He was a glory seeker and ultimately a Christ hater. That's the problem for the church. Thus, Luke tells us, right out of the gate, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. So this assault on the church was not born out of religious conviction, but out of political expediency. He calculated that laying violent hands on the church, if he did this, he could maintain regional stability and further ingratiate himself to the Jewish population he was seeking to rule, who saw these Christians as a divisive minority. Now, two prominent Christian figures are among the first to come under Herod's attack. Look at verse 2 and following. He killed James, and the brother of John, with the sword, and when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after Passover to bring him out to the people. So Herod is striking now at the inner circle of Jesus' followers. James and Peter were not just 2 of the 12, they were 2 of the inner 3, along with John, right? Who were privileged to accompany Jesus at some unique moments during his ministry, including witnessing, for instance, the raising of Jairus' daughter in Luke chapter 8, or the transfiguration of Jesus in Luke chapter 9. They were there with him, asleep albeit, but there with him in the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark chapter 14. So when James is killed, roughly a decade after Pentecost, it must have rocked the Christian community. How could this be, right? So far, they've seen miraculous deliverances. They've seen some persecution, of course. They've seen a martyr. But among the 12, they've seen miracle after miracle. But now one of the great pillars of the early church was gone. Of course, we know, if we are familiar with the New Testament, that Jesus anticipated this. You remember the conversation that these sons of Zebedee had with Jesus wanting to drink from his cup, and he tells them, indeed, they will drink from the cup of his suffering. And that prophecy was fulfilled in this moment, at least for James, when Herod's sword comes down on his head. He becomes the first apostle to be martyred. Now, interestingly, James was the first apostle to die, but his brother John would be the last. But they both drink from the cup of Jesus' suffering. Now, Peter, though, is next in line. When Herod saw, the text says in verse 3, that his execution of John pleased the Jews, he proceeds to arrest Peter also. However, because it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is that 7-day period immediately after Passover, Peter is imprisoned instead of executed because the Jews would not have wanted an execution to take place during the holy days because that would have tainted the holy days. Remember, this was one of the concerns during the trial and execution of Jesus. It was expedited for this reason. And just like with Jesus, there's a sham trial that's probably in the works for Peter this time, and then he would be off to the chopping block, quite literally, after the holidays were over. But in the meantime, Peter remains in prison. We're told in verse 4, there are 4 squads of soldiers who were assigned to guard Peter. That's 16 soldiers. He would have been chained to 2 of them with both of his hands. There would have been at least 2 guarding the doors, and then a rotation of these other soldiers to ensure that he would not escape. We might wonder why there were so much precautions taken with Peter. It's likely because Herod is aware of the rumors that Peter had been imprisoned before and had somehow escaped, and people were talking about this miracle, and so he wanted to make sure that nothing like that could happen, and so he puts an abundance of soldiers in order to ensure that it doesn't. In any case, things are looking quite dire for Peter, and he knows it, and so does the church in Jerusalem. But notice how they respond in verse 5. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. They pray. They pray earnestly. That word that's translated earnest here in the original language, it comes from a word that means to stretch or to strain. You might think of them as straining in their prayers. They are stretching out before the Lord in prayer continually, perhaps day after day, perhaps for a long time. It's actually the same verb, by the way, that is used to describe Jesus' own praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Luke describes him as being in agony and praying earnestly. Prayer is likewise what these Christians resort to in their agony. Herod wielded the sword, but the weapon of the church is prayer. John Piper famously described prayer as the Christian's wartime walkie-talkie, reminding us that the church is at war in this world, but the weapons of our warfare are not of this world. Our battle is not against flesh and blood. We don't return evil for evil. We remember that vengeance is God's alone, and so we must pray. We must call up the commander on that walkie-talkie, right? Who shuts lions' mouths, who humiliates pharaohs, who breaks chains, who opens prison doors, who knows how he's going to react when the time comes. We know it'll be whatever is best. Often that's all we can do, and these Christians, I think, are right to do so. They don't organize a protest here. They're not planning some sort of prison break. They're gathering together and stretching out before the Lord in prayer. They put their hope in the Lord. Only He can deliver. He'd done it before. Perhaps He would do it again. What an example this is for us. Would we have prayed, I wonder? Or would we be busying ourselves with other things in these moments? In an era that's filled with anxiety and social detachment, we are instructed, I think, by this example to be a praying church. This church reminds us that our primary impulse in the face of systemic opposition should not be political lobbying. Not that there's not a place for that sort of thing, but it should be earnest and corporate petition to the one who rules over every Herod. Now, watch what this one can do as we consider next the surreal nature of this deliverance. Look at verse 6. Now, when Herod was about to bring him out, Peter out, on that very day, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. So here we see the drama is being heightened a bit. We are now at the final hour. right? It's the very night, it says, before Herod is intending to parade Peter out so that he can no doubt meet the same fate as James had before him. So Peter is chained here between two soldiers with additional soldiers guarding the prison. And what is he doing? He's sleeping, right? He's not pacing. He's not, bartering with the guards. He's not pleading for mercy from the state. He's not suffering some anxiety-induced insomnia. Amidst all of this intense pressure, Peter is sound asleep. He's just asleep. He knew that he was to be executed in the morning, but he sleeps at peace with whatever his sovereign God decrees. And in this way, despite his chains, he is free. Free. This is sometimes called the sleep of the just, right? It's not apathy, it's not defeat, it's not some sort of martyr complex. It's what F.F. Bruce describes as the calm sleep that springs from a good conscience and a quiet confidence in God. Keep reading, verse 7. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hand. Now, pause. I find this scene quite funny, okay? The angel shows up. Things get very bright, probably because the angel's glowing or something. It's not bright enough, evidently, to wake Peter from his slumber. He doesn't wake up. So what does the angel do? He strikes him, right? That's hilarious to me, right? I imagine this angel just kind of kicking Peter on the side, saying, "Wake up, man. It's time," right? It's hilarious to me. And I suppose this shows how soundly Peter was sleeping. But often God's deliverance starts like that. It starts as a kind of nudge at the side, a sudden disruption of our comfort that feels like a strike, but is actually a call to freedom. Are we willing to get up quickly and to follow, even when the path ahead seems surreal or even impossible? Look at verse 8 and following. And the angel said to him, "Dress yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and he followed him. He did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought that he was seeing a vision. And when they had passed the first and the second guard, they came to the iron gate leading into the city. It opened for them of its own accord, and they went out and they went along one street, and immediately the angel left him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." Maximum security? Yes. Angel proof? Clearly not, right? It's important to see how passive, though, Peter is in the midst of all this, right? He doesn't organize this. His chains just fall off, right? He is dazed, perhaps dazed like a sleepwalker, and initially he thinks that he's just seen a vision. He's seen visions before. You remember the story of Cornelius. He thinks something like that is happening, and he's not really experiencing a reality right now. And the angel gives him basic, almost childlike instructions. Get up, fasten your belt, put on your sandals, like what you give your young child when you're trying to get them ready for school or something, these basic instructions. And then the iron gate, we're told in verse 10, just opens from its own accord. That the Greek there is that's translating of its own accord as automatos, which is where we get the word automatic, right? What seemed like this impenetrable wall and fortress is an automatic door to God. And it's only when Peter is alone in the street that we're told he comes to himself. And he realizes with certainty that the Lord has rescued him from not just Herod, but from the expectation of the Jewish people who were anticipating his death. Now, what happens next is also quite funny, actually. Let's consider the comedy of unbelief. Look at verse 12. When he realizes this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. That's John's other name. Where many were gathered together and were praying. Now, this is consistent with what we read in verse 5, isn't it? The people of God, what are they doing? They're busy. They're busy with prayer. They're busy in prayer. They're busy praying at the house of Mary, John Mark's mother. His mother was evidently a woman of some means because it says many were able to assemble inside of her home, and her home featured this gateway or this courtyard that had a gateway, which is sometimes called a forecourt. And this architectural detail, it kind of mirrors a little bit the way the high priest's palace was described. So it may suggest something of nobility or higher social standing of this particular woman. And by the way, this John Mark is probably identical to the Mark that's identified elsewhere in the New Testament, like Colossians 4 and Philemon and 2 Timothy 4 and 1 Peter 5. It's also the John Mark likely who pens the second gospel, and he is also the cousin of Barnabas. Now, there's a kind of eyewitness, though, authenticity to what happens next. What happens when Jerusalem's most wanted ends up showing up at the door of your prayer meeting? Well, verse 13 and following tells us, "And when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda came and answered. Recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. They said to her, 'You are out of your mind.' But she kept insisting that it was so, and they kept saying, 'It is his angel.' But Peter continued knocking, and when they opened it, they saw him and were amazed." Again, this just cracks me up, right? Peter starts banging at the door, right? And Rhoda, whose name means rose, by the way, goes out to investigate. And Peter's like, "Hey, it's me. Let me in." And she recognizes that it was Peter, and they were just praying for Peter. And so Rhoda runs to tell the others, but she's so ecstatic with joy that she forgets to unlock the gate for Peter, who's just left at the curb, right? This escaped fugitive looking, both ways in the road, wanting to get in to find some shelter. Can you imagine? And when she tells everyone that Peter had arrived, they don't believe her, right? "Oh, Rhoda, we miss him too. Clearly, you're just imagining things. Peter's in prison. We've been praying for Peter. You know this. He's in prison." And she pushes back, and they try to convince her that she's crazy, and maybe she's just seen like his guardian angel or something. And meanwhile, this so-called angel outside proceeds to indulge in rather unangelic behavior and continues pounding at the door, right? And of course, Peter can't be too mad, since he too is a little slow to recognize how God was at work for his sake in the previous verses, as we've seen. But finally, someone lets him in, and sure enough, it is Peter. To everyone's relief, now they join Rhoda's joy. Look at verse 17. "But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison, and he said, 'Tell these things to James and to the brothers.' Then he departed and went to another place." Now, the James that's mentioned here, of course, is not the James that was just executed. This is a different James. This is James, the half-brother of Jesus, who's the author of the New Testament epistle we call James, and he eventually becomes the leader of the church of Jerusalem. It's not clear yet if he's kind of has that position yet, but he is certainly a prominent figure within that church. And the fact that Peter relocates now, instead of just waiting around in this well-known place that these Christians gathered, in order to be recaptured, it reminds us that faith and wisdom are not opposites. They don't compete. Even after supernatural rescue, right, Peter acts with strategic discretion. We too, I think, should remember that trusting in God's sovereignty does not negate the need for wise, ethical planning in all of our endeavors. God frequently utilizes disciplined choices and prudence of his people in order to sustain his mission. God is a God of means, and often these are the means that he uses. Commentators sometimes note there's a kind of divine poetry here, though. God effortlessly opens this massive iron gate for Peter, yet Peter struggles to get his own friend to open this wooden house at the gate, right? And that's also very striking. It's also striking, I think, an irony that despite having been earnestly and unrelentingly praying for Peter's release, they refuse to believe the answer to their prayers has arrived. How often, I wonder, do we sit around discussing theology and theorizing about God's activity while ignoring the practical, even miraculous answers to our prayers that are figuratively, if not literally in this case, knocking at the door? Clearly, God is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, as Paul told the Ephesians. Let us not be a people who merely praise while forgetting that God is able to work miracles. He doesn't always promise a miracle, to be sure, but don't let that fact keep us from believing one. The text reminds us that God's grace is needed to overcome not just the sword of Herod, but also the unbelief of the church. Fortunately for us, the welfare of the church rests on God's faithfulness, not our feeble faith. God doesn't wait for us to have perfect faith before He answers prayer, right? He responds to the earnest straining of the church that is, like us, endearingly human and often surprised by His grace. This passage, however, doesn't just highlight the irony of these responses, it also confronts us with a healthy dose of divine mystery. At the center of this tension, as we've seen, are these two apostles, these two from the inner circle of Jesus, James and Peter, who face the same antagonist, Herod Agrippa I, and yet they receive opposite outcomes. James is executed by the sword, Peter is delivered by the angel. Yet it's vital that we don't misconstrue this. It's not as though God fumbled the ball with James and scored the touchdown with Peter. The king was no less in charge when the sword fell as he was when the iron gate opened on its own accord. There is purpose in both. God uses both miraculous deliverance and faithful martyrdom to advance His kingdom purposes. God may not have supplied James with the same deliverance as Peter, but He did provide him with the same sustaining grace when his foretold end came to pass. In fact, there's a tradition where James's testimony was so powerful in those days that his guard, who happened to be his accuser, ends up converting, and he ends up asking for the forgiveness of James, and they were beheaded together by Herod's order. Now, to this, we could add to the untold ways that the death of James would go on to embolden the church. As Tertullian famously said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. God knows what He's doing. He knows what He's doing. He is absolutely sovereign. But contrasts like this remind us that God's ways are often inscrutable. That is, they're beyond human comprehension. They also expose the lie of the so-called health and wealth gospel that so many in this world are clinging to. Texts like these remind us that the successful life in the kingdom is not defined by avoiding suffering or achieving longevity, but by unqualified discipleship and obedience, no matter the cost. Finally, think through with me the finality of divine judgment. We've come to the historical fallout of what we've read in chapter 12 so far. Look at verses 18 and 19. Now, when day came, there was no little disturbance among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. And after Herod searched for him and did not find him, he examined the sentries and ordered that they should be put to death. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea to spend time there. Now, needless to say, Herod was infuriated by Peter's deliverance. And true to form, he takes out his rage on these soldiers who had disappointed him. Under Roman law and later the Justinian Code, very similarly, a guard who allowed a prisoner to escape was liable to the same penalty that the prisoner would have suffered. So the fact that they're executed would seem to confirm that Herod had planned all along for Peter to have been executed, and that these soldiers had every incentive to ensure that Peter was secure throughout the night. But they were no match for the supernatural. And Herod, he's not just mad, he's embarrassed, evidently. And in his embarrassment, he relocates from Jerusalem to Caesarea, which is a provincial capital. Now, historically, we know this takes place. Other historians like Josephus talk about this, at least aspects of it. He moves, and this move ends up being quite significant. Caesarea is very much a city that's dominated by Gentiles. It's epitomizing Roman culture. When he leaves Jerusalem, Herod effectively drops the ruse of being this kind of Jewish king to become transparently Roman. At least that's the assessment of the Jewish historian Josephus. Which leads us to the final verses where we discover that Herod was not content with being a king, but was seeking worship that belongs to God alone. Look at verse 20. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, And they came to him and with one accord, and having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat upon the throne, and delivered an oration to them. And the people were shouting, "The voice of a God and not a man." So we learn that Herod is embroiled in this heated quarrel between with these coastal cities of Tyre and Sidon. Because these cities are dependent on Herod's territory for a food supply, particularly Galilean corn, they have this political bribery set up with Blastus, the king's household manager, in order to sue for peace. And thus, on the appointed day, the text says, which was likely a festival day, maybe a festival honoring the emperor, Herod decides to respond to this petition. Now, Josephus provides for us, again, not a Christian, but a Jewish historian, provides for us a parallel account where we're told that the royal robes that Luke speaks of here were actually woven entirely of silver thread. And so the sun shines on him, and the glare is so excruciatingly bright that those gathered end up being struck with fear. He seems to be glowing. And when Herod finished his speech, Luke tells us that the people shouted, "The voice of a God and not a man." In other words, the whole spectacle leads them to ascribe deity to this man, which, by the way, wasn't unusual for Roman leaders, particularly the emperors, although he's not an emperor. And Herod doesn't seem to mind at all. Indeed, he is basking in the glory. But it is blasphemy. It is blasphemy of the highest sort, ultimate treason against the one true God. It is false worship. And so we read in verse 23, immediately an angel of the Lord struck him down because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. What a stroke of reversal this is, right? This is the second time an angel has struck someone, isn't it? It was an angel who struck a sleeping Peter back to life in verse 7, and now an angel who struck Herod to death. It's the same Greek word in both verses. The contrast, I think, is deliberate. And the end is grisly, eaten by worms. Josephus actually describes these 5 days that he was in agony in his bowels before he dies, perhaps literally intestinal worms, maybe. But Luke, the physician, emphasizes just the demeaning nature of Herod's end. This man who accepted worship was, in the end, reduced to little more than worm food. What happens to Herod, though, and with any other member of the Herodian dynasty, serves as a warning on the fragility of power. Despite their vast resources and all their Roman connections and all their political maneuvering, each Herod eventually was met with the limit of their authority. This challenges, I think, us to consider what kind of legacy we are building with our lives. Is it one of self-exaltation, like Herod, or is it one of faithful service, like the church that outlasts him? And this is the lesson of the final verses, where the church marches on. But the word of God increased and multiplied, it says. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had completed their service, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. Ultimately, Luke concludes the chapter by demonstrating something of the divine arithmetic. Okay? While Herod could remove one apostle, subtraction, he could not stop the word of God, which increased and multiplied, multiplication. God's kingdom is unconquerable, regardless of the fate of its individual citizens. This is a hard lesson, I think, for many to learn. As Tony Merida explains, pick your tyrant. Pharaoh, Jezebel, Nebuchadnezzar, Herod, God's people have always faced persecution. Already in 11 chapters in Acts, we have observed opposition in the form of threats and intimidation and physical beatings and stonings. Now the sword turns against God's people. We shouldn't be surprised when we face opposition while living on mission. We should be surprised when we don't. Jesus told his disciples, "You will have suffering in this world. Be courageous. I have conquered the world." Sometimes we get a glimpse of that victory when the prisoner is set free. And sometimes we see it when God replaces martyrs with missionaries. But make no mistake about it, we are seeing it. We are seeing it. Even in the worst of times, the fact is no less true. As Jerome said, the church of Christ has been founded by shedding its own blood, not that of others, by enduring outrage, not inflicting it. Persecutions have made it grow. Martyrdom has crowned it. This is God's mysterious providence. It is at work, though, in our lives as well. Regardless of what you're facing, God is working. And if you are his child, he is working for your good. Never forget that. And take heart, because no matter how sophisticated or powerful a modern Herod, whether a political person or system or corporate agenda or vile cultural trend, their influence will also be subject to divine subtraction in due course. Take heart, because the multiplication of God's kingdom is not dependent on favorable political or societal conditions or the survival of specific leaders, but on the faithfulness of our sovereign God. We can leave the final arithmetic to him. And what is it that convinces us of this the most? Is it not the gospel itself? Think of what we have seen. Set Herod aside for a moment and think back to Peter. Theologically, Peter's condition mirrors our own spiritual state in Christ, or I should say before Christ. As James Montgomery Boyce notes, Peter's case was hopeless, humanly speaking. He was in prison, surrounded by guards. He was asleep. He was condemned to die. His case pictures us in our sin. We are chained by sin and are unable to escape. We are even asleep in sin, insensitive to it until God sends his Holy Spirit to break our shackles and frees us. This is a good picture of what God does with us in salvation. He sends his light to illuminate the spiritual darkness of our lives, and he strikes off the shackles of sin so that we might be set free to follow Jesus. It had to have been this very text that led Charles Wesley to pen those words in one of his songs. I woke, the dungeon flamed with light, my chains fell off, my heart was free, I rose, went forth, and followed thee. Is that your story? If it is, then you know that your salvation was an inside job, was not an inside job, I should say, or the result of your own effort. It was a divine strike. It comes at divine initiative, and it came at the cost of God's Son. It is only by his wounds that we are set free from sin and death, and this is what Jesus offers to us: deliverance, freedom, life. He died in our place to make it so. But until we respond to him in faith, turning from our sin and trusting in him alone to save, we're still locked up in the dungeon of our own sin where the sword of divine judgment awaits us. But there's hope. Confess your sin and your need. Call upon Jesus to save you. He will do it. He delights to do it. And if you have experienced this personally, then listen, I would invite you to share with us in the table this morning as we share the Lord's Supper together. If you've experienced the salvation that Christ has accomplished on the cross, then join us when we participate in the Lord's Supper. We are reminded that our union with Christ includes both his victory and his cup of suffering. But as John reminds us in the final book of the New Testament, believers conquer by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony, for they love not their life even to death. It's hard for me to imagine John, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, writing those words and not thinking of his brother James. But above all, he remembers Jesus and what he suffered. Let's do the same as we close our time together. Pray with me.